Why West do not like China trade with Africa, but the same Western nations trade more with China than Africa. The reasons why Western countries express concerns about China's trade with Africa are complex and varied. However, reasons include competition. China's growing presence in Africa and increasing trade volumes may be seen as a threat to Western countries' traditional economic dominance in the region. West criticisms of China's support for authoritarian regimes, as well as its treatment of workers and environmental practices in some African countries. Western countries have supported more authoritarian regimes, killed or overthrown many good leaders in Africa but China did not do any of these in Africa. Western countries view China's growing influence in Africa as part of a larger geopolitical competition, and concerned about China's potential to challenge Western influence in the region. Western countries trade more with China than with Africa. However, this is a contradiction of Western countries. Why West is trying to tell Africa who they can trade with. If West don't like China, let West not trade with China and leave Africa alone. West take loan from China to develop their country, but they criticize China for giving loan to Africa. It is true that Western countries have taken loans from China, and Western loans to African countries have more negative impacts. It is important to note that there are some key differences between China's lending practices and those of Western countries. China's loans to African countries often come with fewer conditions attached compared to loans from Western countries and international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Why West care if China give conditions to Africa or not? It look like West want China to ask them what condition they should put on Africa. West want to keep Africa poor, that's why they come up with those conditions. World Bank and IMF are all Western tools to control Africa. China do not need any order from the West, and this is why West fear China relationship with Africa. Why USA never criticize France, UK activities in Africa? Because USA is in bed with UK, France, that is why they are losing to China. West supported authoritarian and supported dictators more than China in Africa. Africa should ignore West and trade with whoever they can trade. Western loan condition is the reason why Africa is poor. China's loan give Africans chance to develop more than Western. Western aid goal is to keep Africa poor. It is true that some Western loans to African countries have come with conditions attached, such as the implementation of structural adjustment programs. These programs have been criticized for their negative impact on social services and the environment, as well as their role in exacerbating debt burdens in African countries. Similarly, while Chinese loans have been used to fund a range of projects in Africa, there have been concerns about the sustainability of debt burdens and the impact of Chinese investment on local communities and the environment. West cannot say anything about China in Africa. Western countries find evidence of China's loan burdens on Africa, but they never see or provide an evidence when it comes to their crimes and loan burdens on Africa. They used IMF and World Bank to manipulate Africa, and their banks are full of stolen money from Africa, but they never address that. What make West to think Africans should listen to their nonsense stories in Africa? Africa poverty is not complex. West use military to overthrow leaders who do not follow their agenda instead of African agenda. They restrict Africans from access to international market. Loans for African nations' interest are more high. West create instability in many African countries. China never overthrow any African leader and replace with dictators, but West did it and still doing it. Look at the French colonies. The issue of poverty in Africa is indeed, it is true that historical factors such as colonization, exploitation, and slavery have contributed to Africa's development challenges. It is true that Western countries have supported regime change in African countries in the past and even today, and that this has contributed to political instability in Africa. Similarly, while it is true that Western countries have restricted African access to international markets and that interest rates on loans to African countries have been high, Western countries think Africa should only go to them to beg and aid should be given to Africa as charity. That's why in every Western media they only show bad side of Africa. It's always negative. They think Africans do not deserve development, they should stay as monkeys, aid never develop any countries but trade, and they restrict Africa from all of that, so Chinese came in and trade with Africa and West feel Chinese should follow their agenda on Africa. Regarding China's involvement in Africa, while it is true that China has not supported regime change in African countries, according to Western countries, Chinese investment and lending practices have also been criticized for their potential negative impact in Africa. But have you heard even one time America criticize France in Africa? How about the regime changes West did in Africa? French control of African resources and keeping dictators in power. France's relationship with its former African colonies has been the subject of much criticism and scrutiny. During the colonial period, France established a system of political and economic control that allowed it to exploit the natural resources of its African colonies for its own benefit. This included extracting raw materials, such as timber, rubber, and minerals, and using forced labor to extract these resources. After African countries gained independence, France maintained a close relationship with many of its former colonies through a system known as France-Afrique. This system involved providing military and economic support to African leaders who were seen as friendly to French interests, while also intervening in the affairs of those who were not. This included supporting coups d'état and other forms of regime change in African countries, and providing military support to African leaders who were willing to align themselves with French interests. The French government has also been accused of using its influence to maintain control over key sectors of African economies, such as the energy and mining industries. This has been facilitated by the fact that many African countries are heavily indebted to France, and are dependent on French aid and investment to fund their development projects. Critics argue that this system has perpetuated poverty and underdevelopment in many African countries, by stifling local democracy, restricting access to international markets, and limiting the ability of African leaders to pursue policies that are in the best interests of their citizens. In recent years, there have been growing calls for France to leave Africa, and Africa can trade with whomever they want for Africa development. Africans should do investment in Africa for Africa development projects. African leaders should not listen to the West and also should tell the West to respect Africa's choice of trading partner and respect for African sovereignty and self-determination. Why no Western countries ever criticize France for that, but they always on China trade with Africa? Is West fear that China trade with Africa will make Africa more free from the Western control over Africa? According to some Western reporter, there are several reasons why no Western country including USA never criticize France and other Western nations' activities including USA bad activities in Africa. One possible reason is that France is a long-standing ally of many Western countries, and is seen as a key partner in maintaining stability and security in Africa. I asked him how many times France overthrew African leader or killed them, how many rebel group France supported in Africa, how can France and any Western countries can maintain stability and security in Africa. He claimed that this has led some Western countries to turn a blind eye to France's actions in Africa, or to downplay their significance. Another possible reason is that China's involvement in Africa is a relatively new phenomenon, and has therefore attracted greater attention and scrutiny in recent years. This attention has been driven by concerns about the impact of Chinese investment and lending practices on African development, as well as concerns about China's growing global influence. It is also possible that some Western countries are concerned about the potential for China's involvement in Africa to undermine their own economic and political interests in the region. This could include concerns about competition for access to African resources, or concerns about the potential for China to use its influence in Africa to challenge Western dominance on the global stage.